Hello and welcome to episode 210 of the Chills of Will podcast. It's a pleasure today to be joined by Dan Sinykin. Here's a bit about Dan. He's an assistant professor of English at Emory University with a courtesy appointment in quantitative theory and methods. He is the author of American Literature and the Long Downturn, Neoliberal Apocalypse from 2020. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Rumpus, Dissent, and other publications. Big Fiction, How Conglomeration Changed the Publishing Industry in American Literature is out as of October 6th through Columbia University Press. Whew. Good evening. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. And these, I guess maybe more so nonfiction, definitely more nonfiction. They got some pretty long titles these days, huh?
Yeah, in academia and the university presses, they like to make sure that something of the argument of the book is in the title somewhere.
Uh-huh.
And so they want to get all the keywords, and so
Yes.
that can stretch them out a bit.
All right. So who do we blame slash credit for that as far as all these big publishers you talk about in the book? Was it
Oh,
Morton? Was
goodness. Yeah, no, it's that. So it's funny because I published my book with the university press, and
right.
that's a whole separate thing.
Huh.
Then I only touch very lightly
Right.
in the book on university presses because they don't do a lot of fiction. They're very,
Sure.
very, very, very few works of fiction come out of that sphere.
Mhm.
So there needs to be a whole nother book just about university presses.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you. So, I saw that you posted on the 6th. We're talking today on October 9th. You posted on the 6th that the book was out. Like, was that like a surprise? Like, what do I know? But I'm thinking like always Tuesdays. Was the book out kind of like half out on the 6th and comes out for real on the 10th? Or how does that go?
Yeah, it's the official publication date isn't until October 24th.
Yeah.
Which is a Tuesday.
Okay.
But the book is out, and I actually don't know what the reason for that is. I know production went fast,
Okay.
so everything went smoothly, and the books were sitting in the warehouse ready to go.
Hmm.
And so I think someone just said, "Well, we've got the pre-orders. Let's just press the button and let the books sail out." And then we still have our official pub date on the 24th. We'll see what
Okay.
happens.
Okay. Yeah, I mean it's so meta, right? This idea that like when you're talking, I'm thinking of that. I can't think of the name, but the Tennessee publisher you wrote about in the book, who really revolutionized things, like that type of person, like with your book, just like let's send it out. And
Yeah, no, there's a part in the book that you're talking about um where I described the revolution in wholesaling, which
hmm
changed the whole publishing industry, about how books get from publishing houses, well, from the printers really to retailers. And that changed everything about how regular everyday people get our books.
right.
And that was a product of the 70s. And yeah, I believe Ingram distributes my book.
Oh man.
So it is meta. There's all this stuff
Right.
where I'm talking about the making and distribution of books, and here it is,
Yeah,
condensed in the book that you're holding.
there it is. If you can see mine, this is the proof. But so is the cover going to be the same, or if you can see my
Yes,
cover, it is okay.
the same cover. It's a homage to these covers from the 1980s that have a kind of cult following,
Hmm.
from Vintage Contemporaries, which was their
Yes.
big book, was Bright Lights Big City by Jay McInerney.
hmm
And it had the same kind of design as my book's cover. And it was a pretty important series in the history of contemporary literature.
Hmm.
So we decided we'd tip the hat.
I love the homage. I love it. I know, like you kind of in this nether world with officially the 24th, like kind of like a restaurant, right? Like a soft opening on the 6th, and the official one with the ribbon cutting, the whole deal. But what kind of feedback have you gotten on the book so far?
Oh, it's been great. It's been really warm. I was just in Seattle. I live in Atlanta, but I was
Mhm.
just in Seattle for a conference, and I got to go out to dinner with a group of booksellers. Seattle's such an incredible bookish city.
Yeah, it is.
Um, Love it. And I got to go out the night before on the 5th with booksellers from some of the big bookstores in town. And we just talked industry and swapped stories all night. And then the next day I went into one of the bookstores to with one of the booksellers I'd been at dinner with to see the book on the shelf, because it's just a special feeling to see the book on a bookstore shelf for the first time.
Yes.
And I went in and I saw the book, and they had the cover facing out, and it was lovely. And as I was browsing some other sections, I overheard a bookseller, a different bookseller, someone I didn't go to dinner with, a bookseller doesn't know me, convince a customer to buy my book.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Which was mind blowing to kind of overhear the old fashioned, you call it hand selling. The bookseller hand sell my book right there that day.
Oh man, that is so cool. Yeah, I much more than I do about Seattle, but I think of like, I don't know, Gabby Bates, the poet. I think she literally works at the bookstore. You imagine going in and getting like curated recommendations from such a great writer like that.
I know. Seattle's got a great literary scene. So yeah, it's, so many of those bookstores, you walk in and you got a lot of knowledge in those shelves.
So most of the book, talking about big fiction, of course, most of the book is in third person, but you do talk about your own personal experiences at times. And so I want to say, growing up in Minnesota, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, so you talked about how, like, it was a bookish family, and before vacations, you go to Barnes and Noble and get your favorite books, for the trip and all that. And I'm gonna probably butcher the name, but you talked about really being into Xanth.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, right. And I guess kind of like a lot of us, and again, kind of meta goes into the book, this whole idea of like almost like being a literary hipster, no? Like, this is my style, this is my aesthetic, as the kids would say these days. And I read differently than you, whether it's my friend, your friends, your brothers, your family. I kind of wonder about Xanth and the early reading, and then you talked about how you kind of branched out into more like East Coast, Fitzgerald, and then we'll talk about maybe Pynchon. But just kind of like your early reading and what really inspired you and challenged you and made you want to be a reader and probably a writer.
Yeah. So when I was real young, when I was 5, 6, 7, my dad is a boomer who like was in college in the early 70s when Lord of the Rings was like the campus book. Like college kids, all the college kids in the country, it was like they were taken up as like counterculture campus college novels.
Sure.
And so my dad was, grew attached to them in college in the 70s, and then he read them to me in the 80s, in the late 80s when I was growing up. And I loved them. I loved them as a little kid. And then when I was a tween, when I was 12, 11, 12, 13, I went to the Barnes & Noble, which was the first one launched as a superstore, which was the one near where I grew up in the Twin Cities. Okay. And I would go and buy these books from Piers Anthony's Xanth series. And unbeknownst to me, I was kind of the perfect consumer that the industry was expecting me to be with the Xanth books, because they were designed for people who had first got hooked through on reading through Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. And after my dad was reading those books in the early 70s, the publishers were like, how can we capitalize on this craze for Tolkien? And that finally an editor named Lester Del Rey came up with this idea of doing formulaic fantasy that was very similar, or drew a lot of its genre from the Lord of the Rings, but made it a bit more formulaic, and then could sell it in series to the chain bookstores, first Walden Books and B. Dalton, and then Barnes and Noble. And so, and one of the first people he published was Piers Anthony in his series. And he's like, he's like, look, Piers, here's what I want you to do. Here's the kind of formula for the thing. I think it's going to sell a lot of books to a lot of people out there who love the Lord of the Rings, and we're gonna sell a bunch of these. And so he's still writing them. He wrote, I think, is like his 45th or 47th this in 2023. Started in 1977, and so 1994 or so when I picked him up, he was he's kind of in the middle, still kind of early on compared to today.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I got really into the kind of fantasy genre stuff that was everywhere in the 80s and 90s.
Wow. It sounds like you're maybe a couple years younger than me, but I'm thinking of the that whole, I mean, almost like fan fiction in that way, right? Xanth, I mean, no, it's not literally fan fiction, but this idea you talk about like picking up on a formulaic. Towards the end of the book, end of Big Fiction, you write about how Twilight was like in a way fan fiction, right? Something about the book that you referred to.
Yeah, no, so actually you might be thinking of 50 Shades of Grey.
That's what I was going to ask you. I think it was, you said something like one of the best-selling books, I forget the exact term, of the 21st, this part of the 20th century, 21st century, was fan fiction basically from Twilight. I was basically a long way of getting to asking you, was that 50 Shades of Grey?
That was 50 Shades of Grey.
Sorry,
yes.
That was a long way of getting to a simple question. So as you got into, kind of more the East Coast writers, the Fitzgeralds, I know Hemingway's from Ohio, Idaho? No.
He died in Idaho. I can't remember where he started.
More like Midwest, right? More Chicago area. But just East Coast, like, was it more of like an escapism? Was it more like, hey, I can travel the world? Was it like a fascination with the East Coast specifically? What kind of drew you to the Fitzgeralds, the Hemingways, the Conroys? I assume Conroy is the Frank Conroy? He's the one you referred to in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, that must be. So I was growing up in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
In the 90s was when I was a teenager. And these were this was a period of kind of between the fall of Soviet Union and 9/11. And there's this kind of period of, America is the sole superpower, and we're going to control everything and tell our kids that they can do anything they want. And there was this kind of projected optimism onto us as teenagers at the time. And I think I was drawn to dark humor in part in reaction to that. Some of the dark humor, especially of Thomas Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow. But I was also drawn to something different than the suburban culture where I grew up. It was full of great novels by James Michener, Leon Uris, Stephen King, who I still love. But that sort of stuff, a lot of stuff that we might consider get called middle brow, and that can be a descriptive term. It doesn't need to be a term of criticism.
Sure.
But this was stuff my parents were reading, and in a kind of classic teenage rebellion, I was like, I don't want to read the things that my parents are reading or that my parents are giving me, and I want to get out of this suburban, boring cookie cutter place. I want something weird. I want something dark. I want something difficult. I want something that is going to help me distinguish myself from this place. And so I started looking for things that the people around me weren't reading. And I thought that made me special, even though these are, mass commodities that were widely read by so many other people. But at the time, that was it was important to me that I was finding a way as a 16-year-old to be different.
Sure. That makes sense. What was it about Gravity's Rainbow that really just flipped you on?
It's so difficult. Like nothing I'd ever read before, but it wasn't, there are things that could have been so difficult. Like there could be technical manuals that are so difficult that doesn't mean I'm going to keep wanting to read them. There was something about the difficulty that I nevertheless could get glimpses of meaning and glimpses of humor and glimpses of things that I want. Like, it felt like there was a challenge that would pay off. I could see from the beginning that this was something that if I worked at it, there might be something really satisfying at the other end of that work. And the more I spent, I picked that one up when I was 17, and I'd just been kicked off the cross country running team in high school. I'd earlier been kicked off the marching band. I just quit my job. And so I didn't have anything going on. So I would just go home from school every day with Gravity's Rainbow and lay on the couch and read it until I fell asleep. And then I'd wake up and I'd see what the page would be on my face, and I'd pick it up and I'd keep reading it. And I read the first 100 pages and I didn't know what was going on. So I started reading it over from the first page again. And I read the first 100 pages a second time. And I got, I'd get 100 pages in. I'd be like, I really, really, there's something like this book is really exciting and funny, and I can get glimpses of things, but I still don't know what's going on. So I did that 5 times. And so then I was like, on the fifth go round, back to the beginning again. When I got to page 100 the 5th time round, I was like, okay, I think I've got a handle on this book enough that I can keep reading it. And by that point, I was almost starting to kind of memorize some of the things that were like the passages in the first 100 pages. And it was starting to, some of the opacity was clearing up for me. And when it cleared up, I was laughing, and I was feeling moved, and I was feeling this kind of great satisfaction of having accomplished something. It's a book that is juvenile and silly, but also it's very serious about war and love and death and the military industrial complex.
Dude, yeah. I may be wrong. I feel like David Foster Wallace talked a lot about, was it Lot 49? Is that what it's called?
Crying Out Lot 49. Yeah, that's it.
Right, that was a really formative book for him. I wonder about as you continued to high school, college. I know David Wallace was huge at that time, late 90s, early 2000s, with Infinite Jest and his story collections or his essay collections and such, and kind of just you wouldn't call him a bro novel. I guess you would, maybe, depending on your definition of bro.
Oh, it's very contentious. It's very contentious.
Right. And maybe we won't necessarily go into that, but I just wonder about whether it was Wallace or what else you were really reading as you got into college and into your young adulthood.
Yeah, I read Wallace. Once people found out that I was into Pynchon, they said, you got to read Wallace. And I read Wallace, and I liked him. I liked his stuff. Some of his stuff, some of the stories in Oblivion, short story collection, Oblivion, Good Old Neon, I loved. Eventually, it would be a few more years until Pale King came out. I liked that a lot. Infinite Jest, I've spent a lot of time with it. I wrote about it in my first book. I read about it in this book. I've wrestled with it a lot. It's a fascinating book to wrestle with. It's not a book that I love. So yeah, I was reading Wallace. I was reading DeLillo. I was reading Virginia Woolf. I was reading Joyce. I was reading it'd be a couple more years before I was reading Baldwin. Those are some of the writers that were formative for me in those college years, and also a lot of philosophers, honestly. Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein was a really important writer for me at that time, as was Soren Kierkegaard.
I know that Wallace writes a lot about Wittgenstein as well. I haven't had a chance to, I know it's pretty heady stuff.
It's very heady stuff. No, his novels are really his first novel, Broom of the System. There's a character. Oh God, it's been so many years now that I'm gonna probably butcher what it is. But there's a character who's, I think, just a big Wittgenstein fan, maybe.
Yeah. I think I maybe learned about it kind of secondhand through the biography of Wallace. I feel like, I can't think of anyways.
DT Max.
Thank you. I knew it was a short name. Thank you. If I can, an unsolicited recommendation would be not to read his book on hip hop, talking about David Foster Wallace. Not
It's good advice. Good
yeah,
advice.
yeah. Maybe I'll do the same thing as you did and read it, read it another 4 times and maybe finally understand it and find, but probably not. Probably
Probably
just that
not.
first reading. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In doing the kind of work you do, it's it's quantitative, right? I mean, I think of like right brain, left brain, reading and fiction and 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 creativity, as well as quantitative, which is objective and number based. And I know you can explain it much better than I can. And even just doing the big fiction book and as well as your first book, does it change the way you read? Maybe that's an obvious yes, but does it change some of the pleasures of reading, or does it, being that you've kind of see how the sausage is made, so to speak, and you know about the publishing industry and you've studied it? I wonder if that changes the way you pleasure read or just read in general.
Yeah, absolutely it must have. I think this is something that is really core to my own method actually in the book, where I talk to lots of people. I think about a bunch. I interviewed a bunch of people. I read a lot of people's accounts of what happened. And it's really important to me not to trust people's self-reporting.
Sure, sure.
I think we don't know ourselves very well. And so, I don't know how well I can even accurately report whether writing this book has changed my experience. I still read for pleasure all
Good.
the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I can still get lost in a narrative, and I can
Mm,
still like enjoy the sumptuousness of language.
sure.
It's still like the primary thing I want to do with my leisure time. Like,
Mm,
I never have
mm-hmm.
enough time for reading. I'm an English professor. I just wrote a book about books, and I'm like, man, when am I going to get a chance to sit down and do some more reading? That's what I really want to do right now.
Yes. Seriously. I appreciate that. When you do have a chance to read these days, who are some of the current writers, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, philosophy, who knows, that you're really into?
Yeah, I read a great book recently by Martin Riker called The Guest Lecture, which is a weird, funny, kind of academic novel.
Hmm.
That I really enjoyed. Dan Kois wrote a novel called Vintage Contemporaries about the publishing industry, about
Okay.
it's named after the book series that my cover of my book is an homage to. So I had to read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really enjoyed it. I'm currently reading Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren, which is a classic
Okay.
epic science fiction novel from 1975 that I've been meaning to read for years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've cracked about 40 pages in it so far, and so far so good.
Okay.
I'm really loving that, and so yeah, I'd say those are just a few that come off the top of my head that I've picked up recently. Renee Gladman from Dorothea Publishing Project is another one. The Event Factory that I enjoyed quite a bit.
Hmm. Is there one or two that sticks out that your students really enjoy or get into?
Well, I taught a course last spring called Very Contemporary Literature,
Hmm.
and we discussed 4 novels. And the ones that they liked the best were Fernanda Melchor's Hurricane Season,
Okay.
an absolutely terrific, harrowing Mexican novel from a few years back, published by New Directions in the US. That is that I can't recommend highly enough. Just
Hmm.
phenomenal. And we also read the first 2 volumes of Jan Fosse's Septology,
Okay.
and we did that last spring. And he just won the Nobel Prize.
I was gonna say, if someone wants to win the Nobel, see who's on your reading list first, huh?
There you go. There
Man.
you go. So yeah, we that Septology is a very strange, wonderful.
Uh-huh.
I think it's a terrific book. So I would, tell folks to go check that out. We also read Rachel Cusk's Second Place, which is
Oh,
excellent.
okay. Yeah.
They liked all of those. Yeah, my students
Yeah.
liked all of those. But I think Hurricane Season, they would say Hurricane Season was their favorite
Yeah.
on the list, and it blew all of us away.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. It's not just contemporary, it's very contemporary. The name of the
Yeah.
book. All right. So the book is called Big Fiction: How Conglomeration Changed the Publishing Industry and American Literature. And people are probably listening to this around the 24th. It comes out officially on the 24th. There may be some copies out there in the world. I would love to know maybe some of the seeds for the book.
So the seeds for the book are in the seeds of who I am as a reader and some of the stuff we've already been talking about. So like I was thinking about why I've been shaped as a person by the books I've read and the books that were around me in my life. And I began to wonder as I'm reaching middle age, as I'm firmly now in middle age, how did I become the person that I am? Why were these books the books that were there rather than any other books? There's people have written thousands and thousands and thousands of books. Why were these the ones? Why were Vonnegut and Heller and Missioner and Urus the ones that my parents had bought, ended up in my home? Why did I pull Gravity's Rainbow off the bookshelf? And so that got me wondering about how books make it from a writer to a reader and the long path that they take and all the steps they need to take to get to through that journey. And that's a journey through the publishing industry.
I appreciate that. The introduction starts with, help me with the pronunciation, Andrei Shifrin.
Andrei Shifrin, yeah.
Right. So he was fired in 1990 from, I guess it was Random House he'd initially been with Pantheon and came to Random House, or was it vice versa?
So one of the wonderful confusions of the conglomerate era, which is topic of my book, is that as conglomerates suck up more and more other publishers, you get publishing houses that contain many, many imprints.
Yes.
And so you have many publishers that are, so Pantheon was purchased by Random House in 1962, I think.
Okay.
And Andrei Shifrin was employed at Pantheon within Random House for his career.
Is it correct? I want to say Lisa Lucas is now Pantheon.
Yeah, the wonderful, amazing, important Lisa Lucas is now at the head of Pantheon, where Andrei Shifrin once upon was.
At the very least, follow her online. She's a great follow. Okay, yeah. So the imprints, right? So this idea of the umbrella organizations, the bigger ones. Penguin's got what, 250 some imprints.
Good God, I lose count.
With the podcast, times I'll say, hey, so and so's book, it's under this, it's under Penguin, but it's not. It's under this imprint, and oh my God, and if you're trying to tag them on social media, it's just a maze, right?
Yep.
So the idea of I wonder why you position the book. I love the idea. I guess it would be almost like an in medias res, right, where you start the book kind of in the middle. It goes from, I don't know, this 1959 or so to now. Not that it's chronological all the time, but somewhere in the middle of 1990. I wonder kind of why you start the book in 1990 with Andrei Shifrin's firing. Why it was so pivotal.
Yeah, it is pivotal. It is this dramatic moment in the history of publishing, and it's a moment that I think crystallizes so many of the concerns that my book takes up. And Shifrin himself is a figure that crosses throughout the book and reappears over and over again. So I wanted to introduce him right from the start as this kind of through line that readers could follow. And so the scene that we begin with is, yes, February in 1998. It was, in fact, the coldest day of the year 1990, the day that he was fired. And it was a moment that was really shocking to a lot of people in the publishing industry. There were protests outside of Random House headquarters against the firing of Andrei Shifrin. There were op-eds published in the New York Times. There were, people were. It was the conversation in the book world and beyond the book world even. And you had like Studs Terkel and Kurt Vonnegut and Oliver Sacks, marching with placards, saying, "Don't fire Shifrin," because Shifrin had been fired by the new president of Random House, Alberto Vital, who came in to replace the longtime president, Bob Bernstein, who'd been there for decades, who had really protected Random House and Knopf and Pantheon from the corporate overlords, and allowed Pantheon and Knopf and Random House to do a lot of things that they might not have been able to do if there hadn't been if he hadn't been there to be a buffer. And finally, the corporate bosses fired him and brought in Vital. And one of the first things Vital did was fire Shifrin, who'd been there for nearly 3 decades and had published so many important books that were extremely important to many people: Michel Foucault, E.P. Thompson, John Berger, Julio Cortázar, Marguerite Duras. Like these books that were just kind of culturally
touchstones,
crucial, touchstones. And so to see him just so casually fired, it was the sign to folks that conglomeration, this process that had been creeping for decades, might be gaining a real dangerous chokehold.
Right. So I mean, it seems like, going back a little bit, some seeds of the book too, maybe based on like the program era, that book, or I'm not, is that the exact title, but the book that talks about the program era, I think, about MFAs. Was that also?
That's right. That's right. That's a great book by the scholar Mark McGurl called The Program Era.
Okay.
Which was all about how the rise of the creative writing program transformed American literature.
Sure.
Because it's really it's by and large a phenomenon after World War II. Started with Iowa, which remains the most important writing workshop, but followed up early on by some others, and by the 70s, 80s, 90s had really become core to what was happening with American literature. So he wrote a book about that. There's a great book by James F. English called The Economy of Prestige, that's about the institution of literary prizes, about the Booker Prize, the National Book Award, the Pulitzer, and what that has done to shape American literature. And both of these books are part of this larger what's called the institutional turn, or the new institutionalism in literary studies, where scholars are paying attention to the institutions that have shaped our literature. And so my attention to the history of publishing is very much in that school of thought.
Sure. So February 1990 was so pivotal. Obviously, that was a great month with, as far as being my 10th birthday. But besides that, it was a rough one. Huh? Oh man. So 1990, yeah, Andre Schifrin. When you talk about the program and Iowa especially, right? I'm sorry to keep going back to Wallace, but I think about in the cruise ship essay, the famous, very supposedly fun thing. He's so disappointed, Wallace is, because there's like it's basically an advertisement, but it's from Conroy, the famous guy from Iowa and all that.
He was the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop
right
at the time.
And he writes it as kind of as an advertisement that they try to like couch as something totally natural, and that made it doubly disappointing for Wallace. But